It was May the 27th, 1975. In the industrial town of Thornaby-on-Tees, local ladies gathered for what promised to be a wonderful day out. Many were pensioners. Some had known each other for years. Others simply welcomed the opportunity to escape the noise of factories, the smoke of Teesside, and the routines of everyday life for a few precious hours. It was a chance to enjoy the countryside, share stories with friends, and return home with happy memories of another successful excursion. Their destination was a mystery tour, and 45 ladies willingly signed up. But by early evening, 32 of them would be dead. The disaster that followed remains one of the deadliest road accidents in British history. What makes the story even more remarkable, it was not the first time a tragedy had struck at Dibbles Bridge. Almost exactly 50 years earlier, another coach had lost control on the very same hill, crashed through the same bridge parapet and plunged into the ravine below. The people on board were different, the driver was different, even the decade was different, but the outcome was chillingly familiar. The excursion had been organised by Dorothy White, affectionately known throughout Thornaby as Auntie Dorry. At 62 years old, Dorry was one of those rare people who seemed to know everyone. A former mayoress of Thornaby, she had spent years throwing herself into community life, helping with charity events, local causes, and anything else that brought people together. She was perhaps best known for organising affordable day trips for local ladies. Over the years, they had become something of a tradition. They became affectionately known as Auntie Dorry's Mystery Trips. On the morning of May the 27th, 45 ladies gathered for one such excursion. Waiting for them was a Bedford VAM5 coach operated by Riley's Luxury Coaches. Built in 1967, it had spent years carrying passengers across northern England. The company's regular driver was unavailable that day, so the journey had been entrusted to a stand-in driver named Roger Marriott. Their destination? The magnificent Yorkshire Dales. The journey took them through some of England's most beautiful countryside. Rolling green hills replaced the industrial landscape of Teesside, while dry stone walls stretched across the fields beneath wide Yorkshire skies. For many of the ladies, this was exactly the sort of day they had hoped for. Their coach eventually arrived in the market town of Grassington, where the group spent several hours exploring the narrow streets, chatting over lunch, and enjoying the relaxed pace of life in the Dales. As the afternoon drew on, the ladies returned to the coach, and Auntie Dorry made sure everyone was settled into their seats before the coach set off for home. Before long, they were travelling along the B6265 near the village of Hebden, enjoying the final stretch of what so far had been a thoroughly enjoyable day out. The route now led towards Finchale Hill, a descent well known to local drivers. It was steep, very steep. With a gradient of 1 in 6, it was the sort of descent that demanded respect from drivers of heavy vehicles. The usual approach was simple. Select a low gear before beginning the downhill run, and allow the engine to help keep the vehicle under control. As Roger Marriott approached the crest of the hill, he attempted to do exactly that, but the gear did not engage. He tried again, but the result was the same. Within moments, the coach had started downhill, with little to restrain its growing speed. Now relying entirely on the brakes, Marriott pressed firmly on the pedal. But the coach continued to gather speed. He pumped the brakes again and again, searching for a response, but the heavy vehicle kept accelerating down the hill, and with every passing second the coach was becoming harder to control. Inside the coach, passengers could see that something was badly wrong. Auntie Dorry was reportedly trying not to panic as concerns spread among the ladies around her. Passengers could feel the coach accelerating, and as the scenery outside blurred, conversation gave way to uneasy glances. Some looked towards the front of the coach. Others gripped the seats ahead of them as the vehicle continued to gather speed. Ahead, the road plunged towards a narrow crossing known as Dibbles Bridge. At the bottom of the hill was a sharp right-hand bend, which a vehicle travelling at normal speed could negotiate comfortably. A runaway coach could not. Witnesses later estimated the coach may have exceeded 60 miles per hour as it hurtled downhill. Roger Marriott continued trying to regain control, but the vehicle was now descending far too quickly. As the bridge rushed towards them, Marriott made one final effort to steer the vehicle through the corner. It was not enough. The coach shot straight ahead and burst through the stone parapet wall beyond. For a fleeting moment it seemed to hang in the air before plunging approximately 16 feet into a field below, overturning as it fell. The impact was catastrophic. When the coach landed upside down, the force of the crash caused the roof to collapse beneath the vehicle's own weight. The passenger compartment was crushed, trapping many of those inside beneath twisted metal, shattered seats and debris. For dozens of passengers there was little chance of survival. The disaster unfolded beside a cottage occupied by the Seligman family. London barrister Lincoln Seligman had been enjoying a barbecue in the garden with his girlfriend Patricia, when the coach suddenly came crashing down from the bridge above. Moments before the crash, they had gone back inside the house. "We heard this almighty bang," he remembered. "We rushed outside to the scene of total devastation." The coach lay overturned in the garden below the bridge. Without hesitation, they both rushed towards the wreckage to see what they could do to help. What struck Lincoln most was not the noise, but what followed it. There was a massive bang, he said, and then nothing. For a few moments there was only silence, broken by the ticking and creaking sounds of the damaged vehicle as it cooled. Seligman later recalled hearing groans from within the crushed coach as he and Patricia desperately tried to pull survivors free. Among those trapped was driver Roger Marriott. Although gravely injured, he remained conscious for a time and was lucid enough to tell Elsie Townsend, one of the first bystanders on the scene, "I had a bit of trouble with the gears and the brakes failed." Most of the injuries Seligman encountered were horrific, and the memories would remain with him for the rest of his life. Nearby campers had also heard the impact and raced to help. Among them were 3 teenagers who quickly realised the scale of the disaster. One ran to stop a passing motorist and raise the alarm, while the others joined in the growing rescue effort. The Yorkshire Dales are beautiful, but in 1975 they were also relatively isolated. A local farmer heard the crash and returned home to telephone for help. He had not seen what happened, but he knew the bridge. It took more than an hour for the first ambulance to arrive. According to witnesses at the scene, the crewman's face fell as he took in the scene before him. Ambulance driver David Rhodes would later describe it as the worst thing he had ever seen. Realising the enormity of the incident, he immediately called for reinforcements. But it would be another hour before over 100 ambulances, police officers, firefighters, doctors and nurses converged on the site. For hours, rescuers worked frantically among twisted metal and shattered masonry, trying to reach survivors trapped beneath the wreckage. Every extraction was painstaking. As darkness approached, the scale of the tragedy became clear. "I had never seen a dead body before, and suddenly there were 32, Lincoln Seligman said. The dead were laid out beside the cottage wall as rescuers continued their work around the wreckage." Years later, Lincoln Seligman would admit that he never forgot the sight of the body bags lined up outside his home. 32 people had lost their lives, including Auntie Dorrie and the driver, Roger Marriott. Trapped within the wreckage, Marriott died before rescuers could reach him. Among those who survived was 17-year-old Madeline Pratt, the youngest passenger to make it out alive. She and the other survivors were taken to Airedale Hospital in Keighley, all suffering serious head and neck injuries. No one escaped the crash unharmed. One of the passengers later died from her injuries, bringing the final death toll to 33. Back in Thornaby-on-Tees, news of the disaster spread with shocking speed, and the impact on the town was devastating. This was not a random collection of strangers. Many of those who had boarded the coach that morning had known each other for decades. The loss of Auntie Dorrie was felt particularly keenly, but she was only one of many familiar faces who would not return home that evening. Entire social circles were shattered in a single afternoon. In some neighbourhoods, several households lost relatives, friends, or both. The grief touched every corner of the town. Memorial services drew huge crowds and thousands came to pay their respects. As the town mourned and questions began to be asked about how such a disaster could have happened, an extraordinary detail emerged. Older residents remembered a remarkably similar tragedy, and the similarities were impossible to ignore. On June the 10th, 1925, 50 years before Auntie Dorrie's excursion, another coach had descended the same steep hill towards Dibbles Bridge. It too was carrying passengers enjoying a day out in the Yorkshire countryside. As the vehicle made its way downhill, the driver discovered that the brakes were no longer responding. The vehicle crashed through the stone parapet and fell into the field below, killing 7 people and injuring many others. The vehicles were different, the passengers were different, and half a century separated the two disasters, but both crashes had occurred on the same hill, involved brake failure, and ended at the same bridge. The coincidence captured national attention. Many newspapers described it as eerie. Some called it unbelievable, yet it was entirely true. Now, almost 50 years later, history had repeated itself on a far greater scale. But while the similarities between the two disasters fascinated the public, investigators were focused on a more pressing question. How had the 1975 crash happened? The answer emerged during the official investigation. Examiners found that the coach's braking system was in a dangerously poor state, despite it passing its last annual inspection in December. One of the rear brakes was contributing little or nothing to the vehicle's stopping power, while several others were badly adjusted and operating well below their intended efficiency. There were also no retarders fitted. Concerns were also raised about the strength of the coach's roof and its construction, but it was concluded that no realistic coach design could be expected to survive a 16-foot fall of this nature without severe damage. Investigators went on to examine Finchale Hill and the accident itself. Evidence suggested that Roger Marriott had attempted to select a lower gear before beginning the descent, a standard technique used by drivers of heavy vehicles to help control speed on steep gradients. For reasons that could not be fully determined, the gear failed to engage, and the result was disastrous. With the coach now relying almost entirely on a defective braking system, there was little chance of safely controlling a fully loaded vehicle on such a demanding hill. They also found no evidence that Roger Marriott had breached driver's hours regulations or was unfit to drive. The inquiry ultimately concluded that inadequate maintenance had played a central role in the disaster. Responsibility fell upon Riley's Luxury Coaches and the company's proprietor, Norman Riley. The case was not entirely straightforward. Riley maintained he had no knowledge of any serious defects and told police he had checked the coach on the morning of the excursion. Just days earlier, repairs had been carried out to address faults identified during routine maintenance, and when concerns were later raised about the brakes, further adjustments were made. During the prosecution, Riley's defence argued that he too had been devastated by the disaster and had never knowingly allowed an unsafe vehicle onto the road. Nevertheless, the inquiry concluded that inadequate maintenance had played a central role in the crash, and responsibility ultimately rested with the operator. His punishment was a fine of just £75. Even at the time, many people regarded the sentence as wholly inadequate. 33 people had lost their lives, yet the financial penalty amounted to little more than a token punishment. For the families left behind, the outcome was difficult to accept. Nothing could undo what had happened on Finchale Hill, but the disaster forced difficult questions about the safety of Britain's coaches. In the years that followed, a number of important changes were introduced across the industry. Vehicle inspections became more rigorous, braking systems improved, and technologies such as retarders helped to reduce the strain placed on conventional brakes during long descents. Modern coaches would also be built with far stronger rollover protection, designed to maintain the integrity of the passenger compartment in the event of a serious accident. Many within the industry believe that a combination of these improvements makes a repeat of the Dibbles Bridge disaster far less likely today. Yet, despite those improvements, Dibbles Bridge would continue to acquire a reputation as one of Yorkshire's most unforgiving stretches of road. Long after the coach disaster had passed into history, serious accidents continued to occur on the steep descent leading to the bridge. In 2014, 32-year-old James Nelson was riding with Skipton Cycling Club when his brakes locked on the hill, and he plunged into the river below, losing his life. Just a year later, Leeds General Infirmary cardiologist Dr. George Ballard, aged 41, was thrown over his handlebars after colliding with the bridge and fell 50 feet into the River Dib. He did not survive. Then, in 2020, 66-year-old American engineer Craig Barnhart was killed after the brakes on his e-bike failed on the same stretch of road. Nearly a century after the first coach disaster, Dibbles Bridge was still claiming lives. In response, North Yorkshire Council introduced a number of additional safety measures. The bridge parapet was strengthened, a fixed barrier was installed, and warning signage was improved, yet the fundamental challenge remains unchanged. Finchale Hill is still steep, the approach to the bridge is still unforgiving, and anyone losing control on the descent has little time to recover. While the road is considerably safer today than it was in either 1925 or 1975, Dibbles Bridge continues to demand caution from all who travel through it. A memorial stone carved from the stone quarried near Hebden now stands in Thornaby town centre. For many local residents, it's far more than a monument. It is a place where names are remembered, stories are shared, and new generations learn about the day that changed their community forever. By 2022, the last of the 13 survivors had passed away. The coach trip was supposed to be a day of friendship, laughter, and escape. Instead, it ended in the worst road accident in British history. This was obviously a terrible occurrence. What should have been a wonderful day out for these ladies ended in tragedy. Despite the nature of the information, I hope you appreciated the way it was presented. I'll see you on the next one, and I'll wish you bye-bye for now.